It's a pleasure for me to be here with you tonight in this introductory series of lectures that are being offered by the Jung Institute. Since it's not quite 7, let me take the opportunity to say a word just about the Institute. And I don't know whether others have talked about this. The C.G. Jung Institute is an educational institution that's been growing in influence around the world from its Chicago base. We're very proud of this institute. It is increasingly viewed around the world as one of the leading Jungian institutes in the world. And I'd just like to say a little bit about what I think is the larger context of studies in Jungian thought, and feel free later on this evening to, in the discussion time, to relate what I say now to what we will have seen by the later on in the class. If you haven't had an opportunity to see the Omnimax presentation down at the Museum of Science and Industry called The Blue Planet, then I really want to recommend very strongly that you avail yourself of this opportunity. It is a very powerful presentation of film from a number of shuttle missions. You get the best possible view of planet Earth that I think that one has ever seen. And one at the very same time can see the planet in its unity and in its beauty. And one can see clear evidence visually with your own eyes of the burning of the rainforest and the washing away of the topsoil. And right before your eyes, you're able to see the rape of the planet by a runaway species that we belong to. And so I like to say to people when I'm lecturing around the country, I do a lot of lecturing around the country, and I like to say that if you want to get the context of psychological studies today, it's looking at the planet. For the first time in history, we stand at a time where we can really see the actual context of our studies of human psychology, and that is in the limited context of a very limited planet. And Carl Jung was one of the great pioneers in calling for consciousness, and his whole ethical system is an ethics of consciousness. And you can see by looking at the Omnimax film and by looking at your daily newspapers how unconscious the human race is. We act out constantly, acting out in the psychological sense of behaving in immature, unconscious ways, which are not reflected upon and which we do not understand, and yet which have enormous consequences. Now, I say that's the context for doing all psychological studies today, and I think that's true. It's the context for doing all university and graduate studies, period, today. But it's particularly important for studies in Jungian psychology, because if you look around the world today and ask yourself this question: what resources are there in the world today that try to help us get a sense of our unity as a species? What resources are there intellectually, in terms of the human sciences, in terms of religions, any cultural resource at all? What resources exist to help us get a sense of the unity of our species, so that we could perhaps get a sense of species bonding and stop this incredible interspecies destructiveness that we are doing? And if you look around yourself, you will notice something. Religions do not tend to help a lot. They tend to become more a part of the problem than they are of the solution. Now, whether that is necessary or not is a question that you can discuss. But it's just a fact that now human religions tend to be treated as tribal phenomena, and tribal phenomena divide the human race. You ask yourself, what resources are there in universities that tend to help people see the unity between cultures, the spiritual unity of cultures? Very little. You can get all excited about Joseph Campbell by listening to The Power of Myth on public television, and then go to your universities to classes on myth, and you'll find that your university professors are going to emphasize to you all of the differences in myths. And many in the most outstanding universities will tell you that these myths do not come from any common root at all. And so you won't get much help in a lot of universities now with regard to any sense of a common rootage for the human psyche, human mythology, human spirituality. Now, this is kind of unfortunate, I submit, given the fact of what you see when you look at the blue planet. You see this Earth that's beginning to get increasingly problematic as an environment, and yet we still are living with views of human beings and views of the world which are at best 200 years out of date. So, why do we bother studying Jungian psychology? Well, it's interesting stuff, and we all know this is the New Age, and the New Age has got a lot of interest in Jungian psychology, but it is a fact that Jungian thought is one of the very few resources in the world anywhere today. I wish there was more competition. But one of the very few resources that seeks to build bridges between religions, bridges between cultures, which seeks to find a way grounded in the actual hard wiring of the human psyche to see the way in which we are a psychological unity in diversity as a species. And so one of the reasons why more and more people today are studying Jung psychology is precisely that. Because they sense that instead of emphasizing radical separateness between spiritual traditions, systems of mythology, folklores, and so forth, that Jungian thought gives a way to bring human beings into respectful conversation with each other. One of the things that I do when I'm not doing analysis is I am an editor of a series of books published by Paulus Press on Jung and spirituality, Jung and world spiritual traditions. And in that series, we are using Jung's thought as a way to bring all of the major world spiritual traditions into conversation with each other. And if we're fortunate and can continue this a while, there will be volumes relating Jung's thought to all these major traditions. And many other people are engaged in this sort of thing as well. There is a tradition in intellectual circles that has not been very well respected in universities. I mentioned that earlier. It's a tradition that ranges from the great German anthropologist Adolf Bastian, Bastian, to Joseph Campbell, to Mircea Eliade, Eliade, to Carl Jung. And in those thinkers, you get a tradition which emphasizes the psychological and spiritual unity and diversity of the human species. I think that's important. If the human species does not start pulling together cooperatively, assertively, soon, then all this stuff will be merely academic. Yeah. And so that's why many of us are enthusiastic about Jung's thought and trying to build an institution like the C.G. Jung Institute, which seeks to promulgate his thought. And we welcome you, and we hope you'll all become members of the Institute and that you'll all join with us in trying to to build this institution and to extend the implication of its thought in the wide reaches of the world. Some of us like to say Jungian psychology is much too important to be left to the psychoanalyst. It has implications for every other sphere of life. We'll see some of that tonight. But my task tonight, if you'll bear with me, here's my plan. My plan is that we work very hard and lecture on a forced march for about an hour. And I take you through all this to give you a sense of what's at stake when you talk about concepts of the ego in psychology, in general psychology and religion, and in psychoanalysis in particular. Because once I give you this survey, you'll be able to tell, when you listen to somebody talking about the ego, you'll be able to locate which kind of ego they're talking about. Because they're not all talking about the same ego. And we've got to give you tools tonight so that when you leave tonight, you'll be able to kind of think in your mind of the various limited ways that people use that words, practically speaking, and get a sense for the way Jungians use it that's different. And so that's what I'm going to do in my lecture presentation. We'll take about a 10-minute break after that. And then we'll come back and you can just raise questions and we'll discuss the implications of this together. That's what I propose to do, if that's all right with you. Okay? Well, let me start out over here on the side. Ego and self in psychology and religion. The first thing we need to get clear about is that there are major traditions that are very influential among human beings. Particularly Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Hindu and Buddhist traditions, which use the word ego in a way radically different from the way any psychoanalyst or psychologist uses it. It's usually, in those traditions, seen as an obstacle, and it's roughly similar. If you say this, I have a lot of ego. It usually means I have a lot of self-preoccupation. Or in modern terms, we would say I'm very narcissistic. I have a lot of ego. I'm narcissistic. I need to get over my preoccupation with ego or I. Ego is just a Latin term for I, translation of that. But so these Eastern traditions, a lot of their spiritual techniques are try to get you beyond the I. And so if you study Zen, or if you study a lot of Hindu forms of spirituality, or if you study someone that's as influential as the late Jedi Krishnamurti, all of the techniques are to get you beyond the constriction of the I. And so the ego in that sense is something you want to overcome. You want to get into a capacity in your spiritual life to get beyond the ego and its desires. And so that roughly correlates with selfishness, self-centeredness, narcissism, inordinate self-preoccupation. And so you want to listen to people because when you're talking to people today, you never know what spiritual tradition they're in. Because, in the Chicago area, we have a microcosm of all the world's spiritual traditions. And when you're talking with any individual, you never know what tradition they're coming out of, so you have to listen. So if they're using the word ego in a way that sounds like that, you know that they're coming out of a vision of the human being that wants you to get you beyond ego. But in psychoanalysis, that is not the vision of ego. For those of you with a historical interest and you want to study about the history of psychoanalysis, this stuff we're talking about tonight, in some depth, there's a great book by Henry Ellenberger, Ellenberger, called The Discovery of the Unconscious, and it traces all this in detail. So what I'm going to go over with one broad stroke, you can read about ad nauseum and that. But in psychoanalytic theories, the ego is seen as something which is very weak and inflexible in immature personalities. And so what is your goal in development of personality in what they call developmental psychology today? Ego psychology is a term which a lot of the clinical people, if you get into psychotherapy, in a lot of places today, you may be doing psychotherapy with somebody that has an ego psychology orientation. And when they're thinking about your ego, they'll be trying to assess, well, now, how is this person's ego functioning? And they will be asking a question, how good is this person's ego defenses? And what they'll mean by that is, how good are you at keeping your primitive rage from taking over your personality? How many times did you beat somebody up this week? Well, if you beat somebody up this week, your ego controls are probably not that good. And they will do an assessment of that very carefully. And then when they do therapy with you, they'll be trying to find the particular weaknesses in your ego and its defenses, and they'll be trying to strengthen and support that. So their goal will be to get you to have a very firm and flexible ego, which will enable you to be very adaptive in your living. You can think about it a lot like those of you that are into sports. It's a lot like working on Nautilus machines, developing muscle tone. You can think about developing the ego as a lot like developing muscle tone in your muscle systems. And so when a lot of these ego psychologists are talking about ego, they mean something positive, and they want to look at you and they want to assess how you're doing with that. And if it's strong and flexible, that's great. If it's really strong and flexible, you probably don't have a lot of severe psychopathological symptoms. Follow that? Now that's sort of the dominant kind of use of that word in clinical psychology today. There are other forms of psychology, however, and I mentioned two kinds of approaches that are still influential, that again don't use the word ego. And there are a lot of clinicians today, you can't be sure when you go to see, there's no such thing as psychology. There are only psychologies. They're plural. And so when you go to a psychologist, you need to be a good consumer. You need to have studied enough about it to know what you're getting, because if you have a certain view of the human, you do not want to be functioning with a psychologist that shares it has a totally different view of what the human is about than you. It's going to have a lot of misunderstandings, and you're probably not going to get far. Take behaviorism and behavioral therapy, for example. If you go to a PhD clinical psychologist that is operating out of behavioral therapy, they won't know anything about ego. They also don't know anything about self. And they do not think that you have a conscious mind. And consciousness is really a construct of people that don't know anything about psychology, do they? So they're looking at the human organism functioning, and they watch its behavior, and they try to help alter its behavior by very scientific stimulus and response techniques. And so if you went in to talk to your behavioral therapist about how your ego is doing, they would give you a blank stare. Or they would try to give you a conditioning response, which would condition you out of using that word with them. Think about it. They'll teach you not to use that word with them. Another kind of popular therapeutic approach now, the kinds of psychologists that advertise helping you get over your smoking, a lot of those are behaviorists. We will help you with your smoking and your problems with weight loss. A lot of those use behavioral techniques. A lot of weight loss programs use token systems of behavioral reinforcement. Family systems theory is another. A lot of people go to family therapists. A lot of family therapists operate with theories that do not have any place for the ego or the I either. You go to see them, they want to know about your family. And you go in and you want to talk to them about what's going on with thus and so person in your life, and they'll say, well, now tell me about your grandparents. Tell me about which generation you are of an immigrant. And they will do a sociogram of your family history. And they'll start looking at all these things, and they will be interested in the way the system of your extended family functions in its cultural context. And for example, some of them may be a lot more interested in the fact that you're Irish and third generation and fourth child in that third generational Irish system than they are in what you think about the I or your ego. And they will do an analysis of your family system, and they will not even think about what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself or how you experience yourself will not be even an important datum for the therapy. And it's an intriguing point of view, and if you haven't ever done the sociogram of your family, you should do it, because it's a fascinating, incredibly illuminating business. And I'll show you how it relates to Jung a little bit later. Remind me. But there's a good book, if you haven't ever heard of Raymond Corsini, Corsini. He's got this book called Current Psychotherapies. And it's an edited book which includes a good chapter, a good solid chapter on all these theories I'm talking about tonight. So it's a good survey with a great bibliography. And if you're interested in comparative psychotherapy, it's a good place to do this kind of survey work. Yeah, it would be Murray Bowen and Jay Haley and Salvador Minuchin and a lot of other people. And they are brilliant people. Virginia Satir. I mean, they are brilliant people. And increasingly, Jungians and family systems people are connecting and doing interesting work. But I'll have to show you a little bit later how that's coming about and why. But now let me get into the specific history of psychoanalysis on the ego self issue, because what we need to do is get a little feeling for Freud, Adler, and then some more recent people in the Freudian tradition, Heinz Kohut in particular, to get a little sense about some more use of this word ego and of self. Because we're going to when we talk about Jung, we can't talk about ego alone. We got to talk about ego and self. And so I've got to get you to see the way in which psychoanalytic theorists will be all over the place using those terms, and we've got to clarify what different people mean when they say ego and what they mean, psychoanalytic people mean when they say ego and when they say self. Let's start with the founder of psychoanalysis, great genius, Sigmund Freud. And as you'll see in that Ellenberger book, I mean, he really was a pioneer and first really got a clear sense about the reality of the unconscious in a dynamic sense. Of course, prior to Freud, someone like one of our American psychologists, William James, had a real sense of the subconscious mind and all that stuff. And it was in the air. There were a lot of people interested in subconscious mind in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But Freud brought a clinical approach to this and saw that it had a lot to do with mental illness. And he had a lot of different approaches to this, but finally he settled on what he called the structural theory, and this is it here. The differentiation of the mechanisms of the psyche into three major structures: id, ego, and superego. And roughly translated from the Latin, that's I, it, and above I. Über ich. Ich, es, über ich. So, but let me get at what he meant by this. Yeah, this is your primitive drives, your instinctual drives, sex and aggression, he thought. And when you come into the world, you're trying to operate on what he called the pleasure principle. You're trying to gratify these instinctual drives. These instinctual drives are object related. They have a target. So, your id comes out and it kind of looks around and it will fix on an object. And then it will either want to have sex with it or kill it. Maybe eat it, but that's the end of this. Not necessarily in that order. Think about this one now. Necrophilia. It's like each. It is to the great credit of Freud that he didn't clean everything up for everybody's middle-class Victorian sensibilities. He told it like humans tend to be, especially when they do not have enough ego structures or enough superego structures. How many of you have seen the Silence of the Lambs? Remember, Hannibal Lecter likes to eat folks. He just eats them up. Skins them and eats them up. And to understand a character like Hannibal Lecter, you would have to study the great tradition in Freudian psychoanalysis, the psychoanalysis of id. Most contemporary psychologists will not look at that part of human experience and behavior. It's not because it's not there, it's just they won't look at it. So you don't read about it in their books. When you read the Freudian books, you get a lot of discussion of perversions, because they were the ones that would look at that. But anyway, this thing has no concern whatsoever about social norms, right and wrong, what anybody else wants. The id wants what it wants, and it wants it all, and it wants it now. And so when it makes you its target, it wants to, as she said, it wants to eat you up, but then it wants to have you to eat you up again. Doesn't want any concept of limitation, I want to be able to eat you up, and then I want you to be there for me to eat up again, see? No limits. That's what you can understand about the id. No limits. It has no concept of limitation, does not want any, resents any, and will try to kill you if you try to assert a limit on it. Now, these are, we might say that sociopaths today are people that operate out of the id a lot. Psychopaths or sociopaths. Okay. Superego is aware of cultural limitations. The person first develops a superego not because one wants to conform to the culture, but because one notices that there are penalties for not conforming to the culture. If I get into this drawer, mommy will spank me. I know I want to get into the drawer, but if you've ever watched a child, there's a stage in child development when you'll listen in a room and the child will get into the drawer and you'll hear them go, "Bad boy." That's what Freud talked about is the beginning of the internalization of this superego. The limitations from culture and society on what I want. Now, this gave Freud a very interesting sort of pessimistic vision of human beings. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. And Freud really kind of believes that when you grow up, you're going to realize you're going to have to renounce everything and you're not really going to get very much out of life. Immaturity thinks it can have it all. But when you really grow up, you realize, bad boy, you gotta renounce it. So it's it's a very pessimistic vision of human life, and there are a lot of really excellent books that are written on Freud's sort of pessimistic outlook for people. Well, you look at the world, wonder about what you thought about this. Why does the I or the ego develop here? Well, it develops because you still have this id inside that's pressing you, mercilessly pressing you. I want more, give me more, I want more. So the ego, in Freud's sense, develops to get more for the id without getting into trouble with the superego. Get it? It's sort of a strategist. It's the inner strategist. And so the ego is going to work at trying to figure out ways at which it can get gratification for the id. Maybe a little indirectly, but still get it. Example. The id wants to be a hatchet murderer. Line you all up and shot you in the head as you walk up going. And it just looks at you lusciously. Said, I just love to chop you in the head. So it figures out now, well, I get away with that very long. Look, Chicago, you can get away with it for a while. But eventually, somebody's going to wake up and do their job and you're going to be arrested. So then what can I do? Well, I can go to medical school. And I can get an MD degree, and I can have a neurosurgical residency. And then I can take a power saw and cut people's tops of their skulls off all day long. Now, don't split off on me now. Come on, all unite. Come on. Don't split off. It's pretty common understanding in psychoanalytic circles that people become surgeons having a hard time integrating their sadistic impulse there. But also people that become dentists. Any dentists here? Spent the morning in the dentist chair, so I'm getting my revenge tonight. But now for a Freudian, see, they're not kidding. That is a move toward what in Freudian terms? Sublimation. Going to sublimate. I'm going to take this primitive urge and I'm going to notice what the chances of my getting that fulfilled are. And I'm going to find a way to get that urge partially expressed. And so rather than having to give it up totally, I get more of it in. So if you go to a Freudian therapist, a really kind of classically Freudian therapist, what is that therapist going to do? What is their strategy going to be? Think about it a minute. Just you don't know about it, but take a stab at it. If you buy that system of thought, what would the Freudian therapist try to do to you or with you? Come on, have the courage to be imperfect. Anybody?
Help the ego figure out ways in which to meet more of the id's desire.
That's right. Precisely. That's exactly the whole program. So in other words, a Freudian therapist, classical Freudian therapist is going to make an ally. He's going to ally with your id. Not with your superego too much, at least in classical Freudian therapy. Of course, with so many people, they don't have these superegos. That makes it harder to do Freudian therapy. But in the old way of practicing Freudian therapy, they would say, oh, this poor repressed person, so we're going to help you have more sex and aggression. And every time you have a guilt feeling, I'm going to get on the side of your id. And you tell me how bad you feel about what you did, and I'll say, You will tell me how guilty you feel. I'll say, you terrible person. See, I just said, Doesn't upset me all that much. It shouldn't upset you is the message. You get that? So gradually, this id begins to have a wider play in your life and you're less neurotic. That's the idea. So the interesting thing about this, and I want to do one more thing with this before we move on to Adler and others, is it's interesting to think about the theory of dream interpretation that's Freudian, because they're totally different from Jungians. There's very little resemblance at all between Freudian and Jungian dream interpretation. I'll show you why. The idea is you've got these primitive wishes. Your ego has got to get to the point that it doesn't really let you know what you really want. Now think about this a minute. This is a little slippery, but I want you to get it. How would you feel about yourself if you're sitting here in the class tonight and suddenly you become aware of this overwhelming urge to murder somebody sitting here in the class? Now, this is not going to make you less anxious. Chances are this is going to disturb most of you. And so the idea, you're trying to calm this person down, let them function, right? So the ego develops ego defenses. Defenses against what? The id, right? But not just defenses against the id. It's sneakier than this. It's like the ego develops defenses against you knowing what your id's about. It's going to help you get what is much possible what he wants, but it's going to try to keep you from knowing what you want. Get it? This is where, in Freudian theory, the concept of wish is so central. You don't understand anything about Freud if you don't understand about wish, desire, wish, the hidden unconscious wish. Well, what is the wish? A while ago we talked about the wish to kill. Well, the person doesn't need to know that. He needs to think, oh, I want to be a doctor and serve human race. That enables me to go to medical school and cut up cadavers. See? And then finally, people. But so in other words, if I become conscious of my wish, it short circuits the whole program. Get it? So the ego has a purpose of hiding from the conscious mind what it doesn't want the conscious mind to know, and which would mess up the person if the conscious mind knew. Everybody follow that?
Duty gap.
Okay. Stay with this structure of the psyche. It's totally different from Jung's. You get to Jung's in a minute. This id wants things that are so shocking that most people cannot, in fact, most people in their view, especially classical Freudians, thought that would be immobilized. You're immobilized by these primitive wishes. In other words, there's less danger that you're really going to do something than that the anxiety that this stuff is about to come into your mind. You're sitting there in your chair and you're feeling a little squirmy and anxious. You can't get it into your mind that you really are feeling homicidal tonight, but you feel anxious. Need a cigarette, squirm. Need to have sex or something, but not as as an expression, but as, compulsive. Need to masturbate. But the Freudian would say, well, there's something about the breakthrough into consciousness that's not supposed to be known. Because if you start knowing that, it'll make you really crazy. You'll let yourself into some hospital. So the ego has to defend against that awareness. And it's got to plan a way for you to get those needs partially met. Okay. So if your ego is strong enough, you won't even know that you've got those aggressive impulses. And if you talk to a lot of nice people that you know, they don't see themselves as aggressive at all, hostile at all. And a Freudian would say that's because their ego defenses are working real well. Okay, now what about the Freudian theory of dreams? Well, here you are, you've had pretty good ego defenses during your day, and you've been able to think about yourself as very nice all day. No matter how many brain surgeries you did or whatever. And you lie down and you go to sleep. You got to think about the dream mechanisms as like sphincter muscles. They hold it in. What? The id impulses, the knowledge of the id impulses, the psychic sphincters hold that in. When you go to sleep, they get a little bit relaxed. And then things start to slip through. And just as that awareness starts to slip through, it threatens to wake you up in a nightmare in which you would know all this stuff you're thinking. So what do the dream mechanisms do? It censors it. It scrambles it like an actual coding machine in the military. It will take it and it will switch it. Here's what you were thinking. I'm going to do the dream mechanism bit. You're lying there in the bed and you're thinking, I really hate my father. I'd really like to blow his brains out. Watch them splatter all over the wall. Watch the red drips down. Now, the dream starts, that thought gets up close to consciousness. I start to squirm. Then the dream mechanism takes over. It switches. Instead of me being the one that wants to do that, somebody wants to do it to me. Flip. There's a dangerous person in my dream. In the lower levels, it's a male. But as it gets up closer to the level of consciousness and into the form of the dream, it switches, and the dangerous figure in my dream is a female. So it has changed from me, as the dangerous person, to the other person that's a dangerous person. And then before it gets to my consciousness in the dream form, it's become a female. You get that? That's the disguising function of the dream process. Now, when a Freudian is talking to you about dream interpretation, they use it like detective work, because you're going to have to decode all this encoding of the dream process. You get it? In other words, here's the main point on the Freudian dream interpretation. A dream never intends to tell you anything. The dream is not there to tell you a thing that's true. The dream's task is to keep you asleep and to manage your id impulses and keep them from waking you up. And so if the dream process is effective, you will have some innocuous story. Well, there was this dangerous person, this woman, and she was a little weird, but she didn't attack me. And I stay and I wake up and what an interesting dream, a dangerous woman. That must have been because I saw that movie, Fatal Attraction. Yeah, that's what that was. All these dangerous women, yeah. But I don't know anything about my hostile impulses. So you go to your Freudian analyst. And by using these rules, Freud's rules of dream interpretation, he follows it back until he gets back to your wish. Now, the interesting thing about Freudians is they always find the same wishes, right? Sure. I know you either want to fuck me or you want to kill me. Well, I'm not saying they're all together wrong, but it is sort of simple, right? There's a good book that you can read about Freud's approach to that, and it's just called, it's by a guy by the name Grinstein, Grinstein, Freud's Rules of Dream Interpretation, and he lays it all out. Best treatment I've seen on that. And if you know anything about Jungian dream interpretation, that is not Jungian dream interpretation, friends. Now, this is not the Jungian way. Now, let me do a quick thing on Adler, quick thing on Kohler. Adler's brilliant, was they a brilliant theorist? If you want to read a book about Adler, read Ansbacher's book, The Individual Psychology of Alfred Adler. Before I was, this is kind of the history of my life. I did my first book was a Freudian book. My first psychoanalytic diploma was an Adlerian psychoanalytic diploma, and I finally got around to studying Jung like I should have earlier. But, So I'm an Adlerian psychoanalyst as well. And Adler's system is very interesting and important. The important thing, though, he has this concept of the life spot. And if you were to go down here to the Adler Institutes, which is really one of the finest Adler Institutes in the world here in the city, you would study about how to analyze somebody's lifestyle. And you could do it. In fact, one thing you can do to get a little sense of Adler is you can write down when you get home tonight your 8 or 10 earliest recollections. Just write them down in detail. And then you treat them like a projective technique. And every issue that's presented in every one of those early memories is an issue in your personality now. And that will be true even though I just told you how you're going to interpret your memories. So they would take your earliest memories and they would take your family constellation, your family structure. Adler was really the first family theorist, family therapy, family systems theorist. And they will write up a summary of your lifestyle in which they analyze the assumptions you have about other people, the world, sex, work, therefore I must. And they would try to help you understand your fundamental modus operandi in life. What your fundamental assumptions are in life that are built into your lifestyle structure. And they believe every person's got that. And they believe if they sit with you about 5 or 6 sessions and gather all this data, they can explain to you the way you look at the world that is your own unique private logic. And they will summarize it for you pretty quick. Now, that means that you say if you had 3 early memories, and in these 3 early memories, you stubbed your toe, you hit your thumb, and you cut your foot. What might perhaps be an assumption? What might be one of the assumptions that person has about the world and the self? The world is a hurtful place, right? I'm a little bit incapable of handling this, right? If you turn me loose, I'm going to cut my foot, stub my toe, So there, you look at the early memory and you ask yourself, what view of the self and world is in this? And that person has got that, and they live as if that were true. That's the great psychology of as if. Adlerian psychology. Psychology of as if. Okay. Now, Adlerian dream interpretation. Well, you will notice if you go to an Adlerian therapist, they won't ask you too much about your dreams, except your recurrent dreams. Well, they'll listen and maybe write it down if you tell them. They're not going to be terribly interested in your dreams. Now, why? Because the Adlerian therapist believes that once he or she has figured your lifestyle structure out, they got you. And what is that dream going to reflect? It's going to reflect the lifestyle structure. So I'm going to get the same thing from your dreams that I got from your early recollections. And so if I have really studied those 10 or 12 early recollections of yours carefully, I know how the world looks through your lenses. And I know that if I look at your dreams, that's the way the world's going to look through your dreams. So I'm not going to learn a lot about you by looking at your dreams. And if I'm having to look at your dreams again, I didn't do your lifestyle assessment very well. Get it? That's their assumption. And so what will the dream show? It will show the structure of your lifestyle. All of your fantasy materials will show the same structure of your lifestyle. So that's their assumption about dream interpretations. So what does an Adlerian therapist want to do with you? Wants to understand your assumptions? Wants to show you how it influences your style of living? Show you how it leads to the problems you get into? and then help you to understand the ways in which you might have a choice not to live it that way. You might change your mind. You might decide, I am not a victim. If your whole lifestyle is organized around, I am a victim, so there. Then you try to find ways to help a person to get out of that strategy. Okay. One more of these non-unit and we'll get the unit and picker back. Kohut, one of the greatest contemporary Freudians until his recent death. Heinz Kohut, contemporary psychoanalytic self-psychology. It's a great system of thought, great man. He talked about the self with a little s. And so when you hear a lot of talk today among some psychologists about the self, you better listen closely because they probably are not using it in a Jungian way. They're probably using it in a way that is characterized by psychoanalytic self-psychology, which comes out of the latest forms of Freud's tradition. In this tradition, self is with a little s. You always want to look. The little s, self, is what they're talking about, really. And the little s self is very close to this ego. It's close to, but not the same thing as, really. You can't really reduce the Freudian self, the contemporary Freudian self to the Freud's ego, but it's close. So we'll see more about that in a minute. What Kohut said was there are two kinds of development in a person. There is a line of development which this refers to, Freud's system, the object, the libido directed toward objects. And he'd say, in his early work, he said, Freud was right about that. But there's also a line of development having to do with self-esteem. And he put a sense of self and self-esteem on a different line of development from the sexual line, the sexual and aggressive line. And so Kohut would look at yourself, and he would look at how stable your sense of self-esteem is. Now, I want you to take a minute just to think about it through Kohut's eyes for a minute. If Kohut was thinking about your personality, the thing he would look at you, he'd say, well, how do you do in a given day or a given week with your self-esteem? How stable is your self-esteem? Does your self-esteem fluctuate a lot during a week? Or is it fairly stable between just very narrow bands? How does your self-esteem respond to disappointments or to slights? Somebody maybe not noticing you, or if you raise your hand in class and you say something and the professor doesn't or frowns or something, how does that affect you? Are you able to go ahead and leave class without feeling like an idiot? Say, well, that was a stupid professor, didn't get my point. So much too bad for them. Or do you feel crushed? Kohut would say, if you feel crushed, there's a possibility that your self-structure, little s, self-structure, is not very firm. It's not very cohesive. Doesn't hold together well. And so when you get an insult from the environment of some kind, it tends to fragment. They use the word fragment a lot in that school of thought. So if your self-esteem plummets when somebody doesn't notice or appreciate you, Kohut would say the self-structure is not good and needs support and strengthening. You see how that kind of parallels the idea of the ego getting stronger? So there's the same fantasy. The self needs to get stronger and more cohesive and more inclusive. What about dreams in this point of view? Well, again, a self-psychologist therapist won't ask you too much about your dreams. If you tell them, they'll listen. But if you tell them a dream, they're likely to look at it and see what it tells them about the shape your self-structure is in. Now, let me tell you a dream that they would say, and what they would say about it. I'm walking on the beach, minding my own business, go into a beach house, and I look up and look out the window, and there's this huge tidal wave coming. And it strikes the rocks, and it breaks up, and it comes around the beach house, and the beach house shakes. And then the wave goes by, and the water comes back by, but the beach house does not collapse. Well, the self-psychologist would look at that and he'd say, there's still some fear of powerful feelings in this person. And when powerful emotions come, the self-structure is a little shaky, but it does not fragment. And so they might say to you, you're in therapy with them, and you tell them that, and they probably say, well, you notice that the house didn't fall. And they'd be trying to support your self-esteem and your sense of strength and your self-structure. They'd be trying to build that sense, trying to support that cohesiveness in you, see? So the way they would watch for your dreams, they'd see how much disintegration is in your dream. And they'd be preoccupied with that, see? You follow that? Okay, but that's little s self. And that dream is not telling you any great revelation, right? That same therapist would be watching how much you drink. And that same therapist would be noticing now when your boss criticized you, you went home and drank 6-pack. But they would also say, but he didn't drink 2 6-packs. This is progress. Seriously, there's a whole book, great book, in fact, if you have any interest in addictions. And if you work in addictions, some of you may be alcoholism counselors. There's a great book by this guy by the name of Levin called Treatment of Alcoholism and Other Addictions, a Self-Psychology Approach. And they lay it all out about the way you tend to become addictive the weaker your self-structure. And the more firm the self-structure, the less abuse of substances. Or sex, for that matter. Beautiful, interesting system. And easily related to Jung's thought, in a way we might talk about a little later. Okay. Now let me lay out the difference here between these points of view and Jung's point of view. Whereas in these systems, you've got the idea of a personal unconscious, conscious mind and a personal unconscious. Jung really had a 3-tiered system. He really believed that there was a conscious mind, a personal unconscious, and a collective unconscious. And so right at the beginning, you will know that there are things in your unconscious mind that are not related to your personal experiences, that are in there in what I like to call the hardwiring. There's hardware and software in the human psyche for a Jungian. And so it's a more complicated system. You might ask, well, why aren't there more Jungian psychologists? Because it takes longer to figure this stuff out. You can't learn about Jungian psychology as quick as you can other systems. It's far more complicated, far more nuanced. Let me go through a few concepts. Now, you've had some talk about the concept of the complex, right, already? It's interesting. In Jung's thought, the ego is first of all, a complex. It's an organization in your psyche. The unique emphasis of Jung in this, it is the central complex in your conscious functioning. So the ego is the center of your conscious mind. So I'm talking to your ego in a way from a Jungian point of view. And that thing that I'm talking to, that being that's listening and interacting with me on the conscious level is the Jungian ego. Now, this should not be construed to say that from a Jungian point of view, the ego is the only conscious thing in the psyche. We always kind of thought that there were more conscious things in the psyche than the I. And recent research in multiple personality disorder has confirmed that. There's a lot of research evidence in the last 2 decades about multiple personality disorder that, from a totally different point of view, is confirming tremendous aspects of Jung's assumptions about the nature and dynamics of the psyche. That is to say, there are a lot of things in there besides your I. A lot of other complexes that are feeling tone complexes, a lot of them have more or less autonomy, and they have their own kind of consciousness, and you may or you will be more or less aware of them. And from a Jungian point of view, when you say, I don't know what came over me, well, there's something in your personality of those volcanoes. The MPD people say, well, it was one of your alters. A Jungian, a classical Jungian would say, well, it was one of your autonomous complexes, autonomous feeling toned complexes. Think about these things as sort of sub-personalities, part personalities. They are organizations that have a distinct feeling tone, and a lot of us like to say they have their own memory. They have their own view of the future. Jungians love to do when they're first working with their analytical work is to start noticing, making lists of moods. Start saying, well, what are my discrete moods that I notice I have in a week? And you start realizing there may be more structure and order to those moods than I thought. Those may be actually consistent organizations in my psyche. They may be complexes. And when I lose my temper, somebody may have touched X complex. And you get the emotional load off of that. You got to think about these little organizations in the psyche that carry their own emotional charge. So that's one of the whole complex theory. One group of people call Jungian psychology complex psychology. So what do you want to do in Jungian analysis? Well, you want to learn what your major complexes are that kind of tend to come in and take your conscious mind over. That's another interesting thought. The way to do this, some of you wear contact lenses, I do. You can think about a complex functioning a lot like a contact lens. You can think about the ego a lot of the time as sort of your I. And when you are taken over by a complex, you can think of it as a particular complex, a contact lens coming in and being so close to the eye that you can't even tell, like I'm looking at you now, I can't see my contacts. That's the way a complex functions. Say there's a complex in me that is full of hate and rage energy. And it is not in my ego consciousness practically any of the time. But certain events can happen, and that comes in. I think I'm the same person. It comes in, and I look out through Mars energy, And, that whole primitive concept of mask, the idea of putting the mask on, and the mask somehow changes things. Well, the complex functions sort of like that. Yeah. So anyway, you've got this idea of the central complex of the I, that is, if you're not in multiple personality disorder, and even in multiple personality disorders, there's usually one central personality. one central, that knows about a lot of the others. But anyway, the concept of the self in Jung is not the same as the ego, and it isn't even close to the concept of the ego, like in Freudian tradition. Some of us had a hard time telling the difference between, for example, what Kohlberg means by self and what Eric Harrison means by ego. It's awfully close. But get this now, and when you're studying classical Jung, when you're studying a sort of a central Jungian point of view, when somebody says archetypal self, usually they'll write it with a capital S. We should make that distinction here like this. Capital S, self. And by this, they mean the center of the total psyche, not the center of the conscious mind. They mean the central archetype in the total psyche, that which organizes your entire personality, conscious and unconscious. The way a lot of us like to illustrate that is to talk about your ego being more like the earth and the self, the archetypal self, functioning more like the sun or a star with a planetary system around it. That is to say, the ego is not really central in the psyche from a Jungian point of view. And that's very, very important to get tonight when you're thinking about the difference between Jungian thought and other systems of thought. Because from a Jungian point of view, think about the implications of that. If you think your I is central in your personality, you're going to live in a certain way. But if you know that the I is not central, is not really at the center, you're going to have a different attitude. You're going to have a different attitude toward everything. Because you're going to want to know what it would be like if you were listening to the messages from the center. Get it? Here's where you get into the critical differences. Because what is a dream for a Jungian? It can always be seen as a message which communicates more about the total situation of the psyche and not just the I. Get it? Now think about this, because get the radical difference. This is the radical difference that sets Jungian dream interpretation apart from all other theories of dream interpretation. Because when a Jungian looks at your, and this is what I like to say to people, just because a therapist wants to interpret your dream, you must not assume that they're looking at that dream as the source of really important information for you. They can do all kinds of things. You can do all kinds of things with dreams that are not the same thing as a Jungian does. A Jungian is going to listen to that dream carefully, and they're going to try to listen to the inner directions for directing you toward wholeness that comes from the dream as a message from the center. No other system of thought views dreams that way. And you'll get all these people that advertise themselves as dream experts that do not view dreams as revelatory. So that's something you want to write down. A Jungian views dreams as revelatory to the I. They reveal things that the I, in principle, cannot know without the dream. Now, there are other things that will give you a message from the deep center. Let's think about the self, archetypal self with a capital S of the deep center. We'll talk in our discussion after break, we'll talk about, well, what's that got to do with God or whatever, people talk about that. But the important thing is a message from the deep center. There are other ways to get messages from the deep center. Have you heard of some? What are some of the others that Jungian might want to pay attention to? Any clues? Active imaginations, very, very important. So before you end your course, you should make sure somebody talks about active imagination in some depth with you when they talk about methods and that sort of thing. Visualization techniques, in other words. But a Jungian approaches visualization techniques. A lot of people do visualization techniques, but a Jungian has a different attitude about this. When I go with a group of men, and I do a lot of lecturing to men throughout the country, when I have them do active imagination with an image of the king, for example, I don't think their eye is making that up. What the king says to them, I don't believe their eye just sort of made that up. See, with a Jungian point of view, I think that image enables them to hear something from another part of their self that they would not have heard had they not done this visualization dialogue with this inner king, or with this inner queen, or with this inner warrior, or with this inner wise man, or wise woman. So the other thing that you'll often hear Jungians talk about, and Gene Boland's got a great book on this called The Tao of Psychology, T-A-O, The Tao of Psychology, is synchronicity. You may have heard of synchronicity. It means meaningful coincidence. So in other words, if you had any kind of funny coincidences in your life lately, did you meet somebody in Nepal, in some pub in Nepal, and you were walking down the street the other day and you were thinking, God, that was really a neat person I met in Nepal. And you look over here at the newspaper stand, and there they stand buying a newspaper. Well, now, Jungian doesn't have any rational explanation for that. But Jungians will almost to a person say, well, think about this. Treat this as kind of a dream. Ask yourself, what is there about this that I should be asking myself, that I'm not asking myself? I remember one case I was working with, it was at a stalemate, and a person ran into somebody from their junior high school class of a tremendous number of years before, and was able to remember some abuse that they had suffered when they were 12, that they could not remember until they saw that person from that junior high school class, and that opened up their analysis and enabled them to make tremendous movement. It's because they saw that person, see? That's a synchronistic event. So anyway, the Jungian is looking for clues from the deep center of the self, which is the archetypal self. Now, Jungians, as you will notice as you hear people lecture during the rest of the courses, we have different attitudes about that, and you'll hear a lot of different takes on it and a lot of different. I'm one of the people that believes that the archetypal self is very structured and has forms that you can understand and that you can get a little sense when you how you can map the inner world out. Other Jungians are much less into structural analyses, and they stay almost totally with the dream and the form of the dream. And those people are represented, there's a wide spectrum of interpretation, but we all share the importance of listening to the dreams is a corrective on everything else we do. Now, some of us will not pay much attention to transference, countertransference relationships between us and the analysand. Some of us pay a lot of attention to that. Some of us pay more attention to all different kinds of techniques in therapy because we're very inclusive. We try to be very inclusive and learn a lot from other schools. But the one thing we share in common, I think, is trying to listen to the dreams speaking in the unconscious to comment on everything else that we're doing. And to listen to the active imagination, to listen to commentary from beyond the eye. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of the time, the therapist doesn't have a clue what's going on with you. You could have been seeing them 2 years and you get to this point and they cannot, if they were honest with you, they don't know what in the dickens is going on with you. And if they didn't have dreams and dream interpretation, which many of them don't use today, then they'd have to fake it, make you think they really knew. A lot of them, yeah, I'm okay, yes, well. But if you have dreams to turn to, you start listening even more to the dreams, because the dreams will almost always give you clues as to what the real issues are that the eye of the analysand and the analyst himself or herself cannot figure out. So here's another real important difference, and then we'll stop for take our break. Real important difference with a Jungian approach to psychotherapy, and different between that and others, is that a Jungian therapist doesn't believe himself or herself really to be the healer. The healer is really inside you. The authority for your healing is really inside you, and for it to be truly a Jungian analysis, both must submit to the lead of the inner center. Whereas in many schools of psychotherapy, the chief submission is to what the therapist thinks about you. Well, they may be wrong. But the Jungian attitude is that there is something in you that knows what you need. And it's trying to communicate with both you and your therapist. And so a Jungian attempts to create, and this is where we can take our breath, a vessel in which both you and your therapist are in this vessel with your egos trying to listen to the communication of the self in you and the self in the analyst, who know more about what's going on than the either ego. See that? It's a radically different kind of point of view. So the self is a much more superordinate concept and very different from any other view of the self in any of psychology. And you can see why many of us think it's a much more hopeful view, because at least there's somebody that knows what's going on with you. Let's take our break, come back in about 10 minutes, and we'll discuss. Those are very broad strokes, and in everything, like everything else in life, that was the good news. I'm going to give you the bad news now before we get too much further. And then as you go in this course, you're going to want to get them to talk a lot more about archetypes and how they operate in the psyche. And about this one thing here we didn't really get into, and there's a book that I want to recommend by Edward Edinger, Edinger, called Ego and Archetype. It's a good introductory treatment of this stuff. And it will deal with what I'm going to talk about now, just for a minute before we get into our discussion. Needless to say, if the ego and the self are both different and necessary parts of your psyche, and you're trying to relate the two in a healthy way, there must be some problem about doing that, or everybody would do it. I love to say that, some people are real romantic about this archetypal self. They think, oh, wow, that thing is it's just always friendly. Well, Jung didn't believe that. He said you got to be careful when you're relating to the unconscious, because not everything in your unconscious is friendly. And the archetypal self has a quality that we call numinosity. It's from Phenomenology of Religion. Let me write it here somewhere. Numinosity, it comes from Rudolf Otto, OTTO's work, and it means it has a magical, attractive power. It is loaded with psychological energy. And have you heard of people being in manic states manic depressives. You know what a manic state is? That's when they're high as a kite. They can't sleep. They can make nonstop sex for days, never lose an erection, Sort of Mickey Rourke, 9.5 weeks, But a manic state, if you take a Jungian view, now that's a very common thing. If you notice, you'll notice little mini manic states in yourself. And you notice it when you get real excited about something in your life and you have trouble going to sleep at night. You're lying there and you can't quite go to sleep. That's kind of a mini manic state. And you're plugged into this numinous archetypal energy. That stuff is hard to handle. I like to tell people it's like 220,000 volts. You got to be careful about putting your finger in it. See, you got to get that stuff transformed down to 110, or it'll fry your circuits. That's the bad news. The bad news is that human beings tend to fly real close to the sun. Here's the sun, the self. People tend to fly in close and get heated up, threaten burnout, the manic states, and then they tend to compensate by going way out into the outer darkness and get real flat and depressed. There's your manic state, your manic depressive. See it? See that? So, in other words, the good news is there's this thing in you that's got clues to what you need to do to be whole. The bad news is that thing also has in it a kind of an imperialistic notion. You see the particular version in Star Wars where you're flying along in your ship and you get close to the Death Star and you decide you're going to leave. And so you gun your spaceship and you try to take off, but it doesn't go anywhere. It starts going right in on the tractor beam into the Death Star. Remember that part? Well, you can think of the way in which the archetypal self's power is like that tractor beam. It can get you, and it can control you. It can control you in a way that your ego doesn't even know it's being controlled. This is what often happens in paranoid schizophrenia. There are a lot of people that get close to the self, and they realize that they're the second coming of Christ. I am the answer to all of your problems. I want to reassure you, you've been worried about the world situation, but I am here. And, I'm not kidding you. I have, it's very common for people to get in a certain place in their life and get close to this numinous thing within, and it takes their ego over. And they all of a sudden think they're Napoleon or Christ or a prophet. All of a sudden they'll tell you, I've been in touch with the great white brotherhood. And they gave me this special teaching and a new name. There's a book, if you want to get a feeling for this, there's a book you can check out of your public library. It's called The Ultimate Frontier by Eklal Kushana. And it was this character in the Chicago area who had an encounter with the archetypal self and suddenly decided he had the key to history. And he went down here, out downstate, a short distance to what little town? Do you know the name of it? Stelle, Steele. And they've got a eschatological end-of-the-world community there based on the revelation to Eklal Kushana that you can read about in the ultimate frontier. Well, the thing is that anybody that gets very close to the archetypal self in this messianic king or queen form is going to have the answer to the history of the world. The only thing they don't agree, right? I mean, but there are all these people that have got the answers to the history of the world, and they got in touch with the archetypal self. So that is the downside to this. So you've got to worry about how are you going to develop this. You're in your eye. This is your eye. This is your archetypal self, glowing white hot with intensity and adherence. So you've got to figure out how you're going to have your connection with that. That's going to give you a lot of energy and vision and resources for living without possessing you, making you crazy. So that's the bad news. Now that I've sufficiently complicated it, I'll let all of my colleagues that lecture to you on subsequent nights explain all this. Okay? But we've got about 30 minutes. Let me open it up now. And let's have any questions or comments or discussions that you need to clarify the difference between a Jungian point of view on the ego in relationship to the unconscious from the other schools of thought on the ego in relation to the unconscious. Yeah.
On the studio about family system theory, and what I've noticed is there seem to be some parallel with the family system theory from an evolutionary point of view, and Jungian, where family system theory stops short is a spirituality component of it, and some other areas. And I wondered if you can send us. They don't know enough about Jungian to make that parallel for myself. All I know about is family system theory.
Well, you know, she's saying that she's studying family systems theory, and she senses some parallels between the two. And there are many things that can be said about this. And actually, there's a lot of pioneering work that needs to be done relating the two schools of thought. But let me just say a couple of things about that. Here's the way I would relate them. There's this great woman psychiatrist, Jungian psychiatrist and psychoanalyst in San Francisco. Her name is Jean Bolin, Bolen. And she's written 2 books you ought to read if you want a practical take on Jung. And it's Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man. Now, that's not the last word about archetypes, but it's a real good introduction. And what it will help you do is to sense the way in which these archetypal patterns, impersonal patterns in the unconscious mind will manifest themselves in families. So in a particular family, you will have one child who will be permitted to and encouraged to be the caretaker, the one who nurtures. You'll have another child who will be very sexually active and promiscuous and will be implicitly supported in that. You'll have another child that will be rather sociopathic and act out a lot. And that within family systems theory, they'll call that the identified patient. But what Jungians notice is that if you study all these different families, we're not all that much different. The roles in families and dysfunction, let's just talk the rage today, dysfunctional families. You take 100 different dysfunctional families, and you will notice that the roles tend to cluster. Well, the predictable roles in a dysfunctional family, a Jungian, this is probably what you're sensing, a Jungian will say there's something archetypal about those patterns. There's something that's collective and not just personal. It's not just this family. It's not just this person. There's something about the way human beings organize their psychic experience that gets divided up in these roles. So that would be one way to think about it. So you'd ask yourself in Jungian terms, what has my family assigned to me as an archetypal potential that it's all right for me to be?
That's it.
Yeah. And in family systems, you wouldn't use that jargon, but you'd ask the same question. You'd be saying, now, what is this person What is this person allowed in this family to be like? And you notice that we divide it up. And it even works. The Adlerians make a lot about birth order. The chances of your being a real seductive charmer, sexy Aphrodite charmer are a lot better if you're the youngest child. If you're the oldest child, you might make it, but the chances are that you're not going to be. Chances are if you're the oldest child, you're going to be a lot more of the queen stuff, or Hera or Demeter taking care of everybody, all the little kids, in my family, I work on a different system. If you notice the book that Douglas Gillette and I wrote on these 4 archetypes of the masculine self, and we think there are 4 parallels in the feminine, king, warrior, magician, lover. We do it a little bit different, but in the very way you can see the parallels, Bolin. So in my family, it was all right for me to be a magician, not a warrior. My brother was the warrior. I was nice and smart, see? So 7 degrees later, I figured out that there might be more to life than being the magician. Get it? The magician had possessed my ego. The magician archetype had possessed. There are a lot of people around universities who have been possessed by the magician archetype. You follow that? Or somebody that goes into prize fighting may well be possessed by the warrior archetype. They may not have any other richer options. See? Follow that? Okay, other questions or comments back here.
I have a real quick question.
Yes.
Or sort of a discussion. What are the 4 parallels in women? What are the 4 parallels?
Well, yeah, there's of course, the queen, and then there's a female warrior, a female magician, and a female lover. There's a set of lectures available through the Institute called The 4 Couples Within, which I lay all that out, and the implications for relationships. For example, if you are in the warrior and your spouse is in the lover, what happens? Sadomasochism. The warrior always feels justified in their violence, and the lover personality always is full of pain and suffering and can't stop it. You got a boundary problem. If you're codependent, you don't have sufficient warrior energy in your life, because it's the warrior archetype that sets boundaries and limits. See, yeah. So there are a lot of things you can do with that, but there's a set of lectures on it. Yes.
When you were talking about the autonomous complexes, we talk about those in context of the collective unconscious, and that was...
Well, we have, the question is, when I was talking about autonomous complexes, was I talking about that in the context of the collective unconscious? One of the things you'll want to go into with your other speakers is the way in which an archetype and a complex are related. And it's a subtle business. At the heart of every complex is probably some archetypal core. Say you have a complex with regard to authority figures, and you have a very hard time feeling your own authority when you're around your boss. And say if you had to go in and present to a committee of people and you felt very weak and unable to do that, you would say, there's a complex there. You notice when you're going through your day, you're fine. You can think. You know all this stuff. But the minute you get in that room, your brain dead, right? Well, they would say that's an autonomous complex. But you can also see that there's something archetypal going on there. You're projecting something on those people that is really in you. It's an archetypal power. You're giving away your power in some way. And there's almost always an archetypal image or dimension to that. For example, I will always ask a man. If a man tells me he feels very impotent and he doesn't feel his own power, I will always say, well, who are you giving the king to? Who's carrying the king, the inner king for you? Obviously, you're not carrying it inside. You're giving it away. Could be the person that's chairing that committee. You're putting that king stuff on them. And you're not seeing them as a flawed, imperfect human being like you, with whom you can maintain your power. You're seeing them as Zeus, the great king god of Olympus, that if you don't hold your mouth right, he's going to hit you with a lightning bolt, burn you to a crisp. So any man who feels impotent and not empowered is projecting that king aspect on another man. Or a woman, by the same token, although the feminists need to do more work with the queen archetype, a woman who feels not empowered, she doesn't feel like she is capable of being clear about what she wants to create around her. That is a queen problem, in my view. She projects that out somehow. Other comments or questions back here? Let's have another one. Yeah.
You mentioned early on when you're talking about ego, you'll get this primitive rage out of it. Does it have to be rage? Can there be other powerful emotions like that? That's going to be the one I heard the most.
Oh, yes. The comment is about, I've mentioned rage a lot. It's the one, I just use that for illustrative purposes. Any emotions, any very powerful emotions, particularly emotions that threaten to overwhelm you, will often be what a Jungian would talk about as this would be a complex. Complexes by definition carry an emotional charge. And if it is a feeling that you're aware of and you carry it a lot and you're aware of it and conscious about it and you know where it's coming from, you wouldn't emphasize that it be an autonomous complex, right? You just got, I've got this thing about vegetarians. And they make me sick, and every time I talk to one, I want to go and eat a 16-ounce steak. And so I know that, and that doesn't surprise me, and I don't go off into tirades about vegetarians when you and I are trying to discuss business or something, right? So that's not such an autonomous complex. I may have a complex about it, but it's not something that bounces around inside me like a loose cannon. However, the autonomous complex is one that kind of grabs you and you don't know where it came from. And, for example, it can be equally an erotic complex. And this is the kind of thing, you'll think you're a very, not very much in touch with your libido. And everybody else reads all these sexy magazines and everything and, acts out a lot, but you don't. And so one day, you're just tending to your business. You're a happily married person, and all of a sudden you meet this individual and all of a sudden, damn, you suddenly are overwhelmed with all of this erotic energy. And it is overwhelming. And all of a sudden you try to find out who this person is, and you call them up, and they hang up, and you call them up again, and they hang up, and you go through the phone company and hire a private detective, and you find out what their name is, so forth, so on. You start pursuing them. You look at me like I'm talking about something that doesn't happen. This stuff happens all the time, and you don't ever know when somebody's going to have that kind of autonomous complex pop on you. Like that. And I don't mean just that it happens in you. I'm talking about happens to somebody else's complex. All of a sudden, you didn't think you were all that great looking. But all of a sudden, there's somebody that is totally, you think I'm kidding? Listen, I know a lot of cases of this. They're obsessed with you. fatal attraction, Vil. And you start saying to yourself, I'm going to get a peace bond on this person. Good luck, with a peace bond and 75 cents, you can get a cup of coffee, in terms of stopping people. But so it doesn't have to be just rage. This erotic thing, when this lover energy comes in, and especially if you've caught yourself kind of if you don't think you're a great lover, here's the news. I'll often have all these guys and folks say to me, well, that's not in me, And when they tell me that, I do look out, because Aphrodite is in there and Eros is in there. And the more you're convinced that particular energy, that archetypal energy is not in your hard wiring, the more vulnerable you are to having that thing come up and like Moby Dick. Whoa. I'm not kidding you. And it can be any of these powerful affects, or it can be an obsessive thought. It can come from the magician sector of the psyche and not be in the body or aggression at all. It can be an obsessive thought. You can suddenly get fascinated by the number 3. You go to the public library and you get into all the books on numerology, and you learn, I'm not kidding you, you learn everything in the world about 3. You're the world's foremost authority on 3. Oh, the symbolism of 3 in the Persian Empire. A lot of theologians like that. Other comment. Yeah. He's asking the question about the shadow. It's great because we're going to complexify all this as we go, see. But see, your ego consciousness, your I, is an organization is predominant most of the time. But Freud wasn't altogether wrong. There are complexes in you that don't get much attention from you. And one of those organizations in you that doesn't get much attention is your shadow. And you might think about this as the mirror image of yourself. That is, the total psyche in you is whole and your ego is not. Therefore, if you are a very aggressive man, your shadow might be much more receptive. Or if you're a very thinking type conscious mind, your shadow might be much more sensual. And one of the things this gets you to dream interpretation, you can look in your dreams and you notice these figures in your dreams that are of your same sex that you don't know in the outer world. And ask yourself, what part of me is imaged? What part of my shadow is imaged by this figure in the dream? Now, with most of us nice guys, we will have dreams of very antisocial characters in our dreams. And that's a shadow figure. But on the converse side, a lot of very antisocial men will have dreams of very positive, responsible figures in their dreams. You follow that? So the shadow is in tension with the ego consciousness, but the self, let's see if anybody can figure out, from the point of view of the self, what would the self be trying to do to your entire personality? Integrate it. So the self would be trying to set it up so you and your shadow, you get noise, and kind of learn to respect each other. So in other words, there's a part of you that you would not approve of, that you need to befriend. And that would be what the self would have as an agenda. That'll become clearer as you go through these different lectures because they're going to all talk about that sort of thing. Yes.
The self is a polar opposite. Is it? That means there can be some good quality.
You mean a shadow?
Shadow, yeah.
Yes.
There can be good qualities there as well.
it can be what we like to call sometimes the golden shadow. He's saying the shadow's not always bad. That's right. It's often the ego thinks it's bad. But let me give you an example. Say you're a very self-effacing person. Humble. I say, I listen to you talk for a while and I say to you, gosh, you're really smart. You say, Or you do a little artwork and I look at it and I say, wow, that's really great. Nah. And a lot of people, that's a shame issue, right? You notice a lot of people with shame issues, any compliments, they cannot take them. Well, in that case, your shadow, anytime a person has shame like that, you have a shadow that thinks it's beautiful. Thinks it's wonderful. Now, that's what I would call a golden shadow. That's your self-esteem in there. You've got to make contact with that part of you that thinks you're just wonderful before you're going to be healed. That's another good thing about Jungian psychology. We think we're different from Freud on this. We have that alchemical image, lead into gold. Well, we really believe that when you really get into your individuation process, you ought to be able to claim a lot more of your gold, not be ashamed of it. So that would be an example of the golden shadow, say. You can really feel your shining and affirm it. Goes against Christian precepts, I know. It's one of the nice things about you. Yeah.
In analysis, if you were to come along one of those complexes that had more to do with the collective unconscious, that personal unconscious, the history of that person, how does the analyst work in terms of responsibility when it comes to that issue of a person taking responsibility in their present light before the influence of that collective?
Everybody hear that? She's saying if you run on it in therapy and you run on one of these collective grounded, complex that's grounded on one of these impersonal patterns, what about the responsibility in therapy? And here's a rule. You always want to help the ego form a conscious relationship to all the forms in the collective unconscious. In other words, you want to get conscious about what this pattern is that's trying to live you. Give you an example from my life. I've already given you one. This magician in me, he's a really interesting fellow. But if he had his way, all I would ever do is research and write. I wouldn't do anything but that. This magician in me can think of hundreds of interesting books to write, research and write. Wants to know everything, wants to know all the possible theories. See? And wants to know what's wrong with all of them. And so you've got a responsibility. That's a collective. That's an impersonal thing. Everybody in this room has got a magician, just like mine. And the more you're in touch with that thing, the more it's going to want to know. And it's going to want more degrees. See? And there's nothing wrong with that part of you. It's just you got to realize if it has its way, you won't have any relationships. You'll never have any sex. You won't take any responsibility for the culture in the world. And if there's any social problems, you will study it. You'll form a commission to study it. I'm serious. And you can always tell what's wrong with the university mind because it tends to be dominated by that. See? There's nothing wrong with the archetype, but there's a lot wrong with being dominated by it. See? And all the other archetypes are like that. If you tend to be a person, for example, if you're a woman, Boland's book is great. You got to get into Boland's book and just ask yourself, which of these archetypal patterns is living me? If you're a woman and you just love being at home and quiet, you love just being there, not having the radio on or anything. You love having everything flowers arranged and fire burning in the fireplace. Nobody, no kids around. It's Hestia, keeper of the hearth. She can be quiet, loves it, doesn't need anybody else around at all. See? But now, that's wonderful to be able to be that way. We all need to be able to be that way, right? Sometimes. But if that thing has got you, that's where you'll stay. You'll say, well, I'm an introvert. See? And you will stay there, and that's all you will do. See? And if you got diagnosed, if you ever went out enough for somebody to notice you, to diagnose you, they would say, oh, this is an asocial personality. Or this person is schizoid. Because people that are dominated by Hestia are schizoid. Yeah? Other comment. Do you follow that? These things are impersonal. And you've got to ask yourself, which one of these impersonal programs has got me going? Or which two? There'll usually be more than one. Yes. The more complicated, the better, because if it can be real complicated, then you've got a very nuanced personality. So if it's harder to find the one pattern that tends to dominate you, congratulations. Either you're almost psychotic or fully integrated. Yeah. Huh? But seriously, the goal is to become much more, to include worlds. That's the wonderful thing about Gene Bolden's work. It's like you want all these women in you, and then you start working on the contrasexual, and you want all those men in you. And for the men, you want all these men in you. And then when you really get into the deep contrasexual work, you want to be able to know all those women in you so that you can know all those women out there and feel comfortable with them. Because it's very interesting to look and see if you're a woman, what kind of man can I simply not stand? Well, it's part of your animus that you're not in touch with. Some archetypal sector of masculinity that you have a difficult time dealing with in you. See? And it's really fascinating because what you will watch in your relationships always tend to be complete. Hermaphroditically complete. That is, they tend to have two people carry both ends. Each carry one end of the stick. So if you're uncomfortable with your aggression, you will find somebody to abuse you so you can stay in touch with your aggression. You follow that? If you're uncomfortable with your vulnerability, you will find somebody that's vulnerable so that you can stay in touch with your vulnerability. But you won't know it. So it can be very subtle, but the more complicated and nuanced, the better. Because that means you are rich. You contain worlds. And see, that's one of the great things about, here's the good thing about Jungian thought. And, the more you learn about the human person, the less constricted you are. The more you realize how incredibly wonderful and rich and glorious they are. All of them. And the more you look at human beings through the eyes of Jung, you can never fathom them in some simplistic little formula. And that even if the person you're working with seems very simple and very flat, that that's only one little facet of the jewel of their selfhood. So a Jungian therapist never looks at a person that seems very simple and flat emotionally and says, well, obviously this is an inadequate personality and they've not got anything in there. There are a lot of therapists operating in your mental health system out here in Illinois that really believe that somebody who comes in with that kind of flat, simple presentation, that's all there is to them. See? And frankly, that is horrible because people need better than that from their healers, right? Yeah, one more comment. Okay, that's a really excellent question. What is the difference between Jung's psychology and what is then known as the human potential movement in psychology? Well, there is a kind of a relationship between them because they both do talk about the far reaches of human nature, as Abraham Maslow said, the farther reaches of human nature. The thing about Jung's psychology, though, if you study Jung's psychology, we can talk about the human potential to be a Hitler. We can talk about the archetypal ground for monsters. In other words, if you study a little human history, you notice that we are monstrous a lot. We're not just nice little New Age types who are just full of light and meditating and all this. You know, you turn your back on us, and we'll take a whole people and put them in the mountains and starve them to death. And whole governments will say, oh, this can't be helped. We're the kind that, you know, a whole people can be being gassed in concentration camps. And the State Department of the greatest country on earth can turn an official eye and ear away from that. Just not noticing. Now, Jung was not a Pollyanna. He believed that evil was real, and he thought you need to have a psychology of evil. And that is the major difference between Carl Rogers and that particular wing of the human potential talk and Carl Jung, because Rogers believed that if you just had the right kind of support and nurture, that there wouldn't be a thing evil in you. And Jung believes that you could have the best parenting in the world, best education in the world, and you could become a Nazi SS butcher. Because there are things that are archetypal in your psyche that if they get constellated and take over your ego, you can become a monster. And that is historically documented ad nauseum. And that's another reason why you want to say, why be a Jungian? Why study Jungian thought? Because it is far more inclusive and comprehensive of the vast, vast reaches of our human nature. Now, we are magnificent. We are magnificent beings, but we are magnificently destructive when you get possessed by the Shiva god or the Kali goddess, and that's in the unconscious. And there's a certain mysterious, numinous gloriousness to that evil that takes people's minds over. So that's why Jung was fascinated with evil and did more on the psychology of evil than anybody else. And so that's it's one of the things we study. But the challenge is, look, we need a psychology today like we never needed one before. Jung needed it. I mean, in 1930s, he was trying to help people understand the situation. The situation for the human species and all other species is far worse now than it was in 1936. And we need a psychology which is adequate to deal with the complexity of both our glorious potential and our enormous destructiveness. And that can help us get conscious enough that we can start taking responsibility for all of these potentials, see. And that's why I'm a Jungian. And that's why I'm happy that you're taking the time to study this stuff. Thanks a lot.